What's up everyone? I'm Bind and today you're gonna see me struggle. But I'm going to make it as pleasant as possible. So here's the premise. Can you paint a really nice science fiction image with just watercolor? The quick answer to that is yes, but it's really hard. So, as you might imagine, I've done this before. Also, as you might have seen on my Instagram or my ArtStation, that's kind of my secret obsession of mine, doing something analog that is really not meant to be done fully analog. That's kind of a stretch to say, because I know you can do, of course, everything in art, and you should never say that it's not meant to be something. You're not creating anything new with that kind of a mindset. However, different media, it's easier to make certain stuff and harder to make other stuff. So I have done this before. I have created stuff like this, or this, or that one, or this one. So I have some experience with the struggle. And why do I keep saying it is a struggle? So let me explain. Traditionally, watercolor is, I would say, a medium mostly used for to citate the reality in impressionistic manner. So you see people sitting in Italy, in France, or just doing it from photo references, and then just painting reality. And because the watercolor is restrictive and has a mind of its own, and it's hard to control, the results are kind of very stylized and very nice looking. If you can control it, and if you can manage to get a good color composition and to basically interpret reality through this more of an imperfect media, it can look really nice and appealing. And there's great artists who have done this, still doing it with great success, and it's awesome. Now, fictional art is very different, because you cannot just sit there in Italy or France, look at something and paint it. And on top of that, so you have to come up with the subject matter, which in my case, if you know me, I like to be original with my artwork, which means I like to come up with stuff and not just draw from reference, right? Which is, of course, has its own challenges to it. So in this case, if you not only come up with everything on the canvas yourself, but it's also has a theme to it like science fiction, which means a lot of artificial stuff, a lot of light and shadow, a lot of bright colors. It's really no secret that watercolor is not suited to do this, because you would much rather have a media that will allow you to put bright tones over dark tones, to do artificial lighting, to do blending. All of that stuff, you can forget about it in watercolor. It does not work, right? So every highlight, every bright color, you have to basically leave empty space for it. Once you apply color, you're done. You lose all the contrast, you lose all the highlights. There is no going back if you stay in pure watercolor. Now, there's artists who combine watercolor with markers, or with art pencils, or like monochromos, stuff like that, or even gouache painting, so paints that are opaque, to create highlights, to be able to put bright on dark tones. But in traditional watercolor, you cannot. And this is basically what we're doing today. We're not using any mixed media. We're just doing watercolor, see where we get at and see what we can produce with that. So let's get into it. So of course, first we'll do the usual preparations, which I cut short a little bit, and I'll get to the why in a second here. So we're starting painting, and immediately pretty much something felt off to me. But I couldn't quite say what it was in the beginning, but the colors seemed to behave weird. And no matter how much water I poured onto the paper, it was just, my brush was always feeling dry. Now a little bit forward, trying to get this guy. I'm already, you can see like that gesture in my left hand, which is basically a what the fuck gesture. Something was clearly wrong. You see the staininess, the stickiness of the color. So the paper behaved weird, the color behaved weird, everything was weird. And I started to question even if there's something wrong with the brush. The brush felt sticky. It was just, something was not right, to say the least. So I decided that this was done. See the bleeding of that paper and how it just bled right through the paper. Something was not adding up here. So guys, this is the first struggle. Which you look at this shit. You saw what just happened. You might not understand it, but what just happened is that the paper gave up on me, basically. So if you know anything about watercolor, it's that it should never look like this. See how the paint soaked into the paper as if it was just a towel, right? So the color completely absorbed, unable to move the pigment on the paper. You saw me touching the paper and getting really angry. And the reason is because this should never happen, right? So why did it happen? Because, and I didn't really know this, it didn't happen for me in a very long time. So what happened is the paper went bad. Yeah, that's the thing apparently. So this very expensive paper by a French company, Canson, just has of course a sealing on top of the paper like all watercolor paper has, so that the color does stay on the surface, right? So and that sealing is composed of some chemicals and some some natural stuff too, like gelatin and some compounds. So what happens is over time they can break down, and what then happens is the sealing on the paper, it does no longer work. So, and it's exactly what happened here. I don't know how common this is. Never happened to me in a very long time. Like I'm talking 10 years at least. Right. So, but immediately when it happened, it was clear to me. That's why you saw me messing around with the paper, but that this should not happen, and the color should not behave like this. So, what now? You have to do it again. So I did the sketch again, and let's see if we have more luck with a different paper from a different manufacturer, which is not as pristine, but I can't use that paper again, obviously. And also I'm afraid to use the other sheets from that same batch, because they all might be the same. So let's hope it will get better in a minute. Stay tuned. So after doing the sketch again for like an hour or 90 minutes, preparing everything again, including the paper, I started out pretty much the same way. You can see that it clearly is a different paper and a different sketch. And alas, things were different here. Things were as expected. You can clearly see the bright color. popping up here, that's exactly the water staying wet on top of the paper, staying, as you can see the glaze from the water. That's exactly how it should behave. So you pour some water and it just stays there. You can clearly see it in the reflection. And then you work through the water and add color, and intense color in this case. So that being said, you might ask yourself, well, is that how you start in watercolor? And the answer to that is no. Usually you do it quite different. But in the beginning I elaborated that painting science fiction, painting like a difficult stuff from imagination that you plan out in your head, you sometimes have to take a different approach. And that's exactly what you're seeing here. Usually in watercolor you would wet the entire paper and you would start with the bright tones in the sky and you would make a foundation pretty much almost for the entire image. The problem with that is once you do that, once you so much as pour water and very faint tones over the entire paper, you lose a lot of contrast because your white of the paper is gone by that moment and you can never get it back. So that is fine if you draw daytime scenes where there's only darker and darker shapes are adding up as you move to the foreground, like with a lot of the live drawings that I mentioned earlier from just cityscapes or nature, realistic daytime paintings. You can add the dark tones and it's fine. But if you want painting something like that is not daytime or even night or has a lot of artificial lights, bright tones, you have to leave them empty. So in this case, since those buildings are illuminated by the sun, by the late sun, I figured I would paint them first to get the bright tones onto the pure white paper. Before then, basically painting around with the sky, which is something that is not traditional. You shouldn't, if you read any book about watercolor, they tell you not to do this, but I'm doing it nonetheless. But it's kind of know the rules in order to know when to break them or when you have to break them, and this is what I think is happening here. So now we do a lot of more intense tones in the sky. I got little spray bottle out to be able to keep parts of the paper wet if I would need it, which I don't do a lot. There's people that only work in wet watercolor all of the time, but for this more graphical style you simply cannot do it because the shapes would get distorted. The shapes would just fizzle out with the water. So now painting with those tones from the sky, establish some shadows on the background, or I should say maybe the midground, you could call that, these more pronounced buildings. And also I left the whole bottom part, I left it also empty because there is going to be again a lot of contrast. There will be shiny metal on the armors, there will be artificial lights emitting from somewhere. So it's just, and especially with this paper, which is a cold press, where the water eventually soaks into it, so it's very hard to keep the entire image wet until you're done with like everything, sparing all the whites that you want to spare and getting all the shapes perfect. You basically will not be able to do it, at least I'm not able to do it. So that's why the bottom part is still white. So other than that, I'm pretty much working traditional from bright to dark, the way you should be doing with watercolor. So no surprise there once you have the tones established or background colors established. I'm still not quite satisfied with the sky, which I will get to in a minute. But first, I have to do the overlapping of this spaceship here, which, truth be told, I was not sure how this would turn out. And there's always something that probably, if you're not very experienced in watercolor, you should do something simple first. Every time contrasty stuff is overlapping each other and the shapes get complicated, it's a high risk to take, because you cannot correct the more intense colors. It gets very hard to correct anything. Now this is a second take on the sky, using a big wet brush here to lose the pigment. And then what I want to achieve is I want to make it more even, because I don't want to have such pronounced differentiation in tones and clouds that I did have. Because it kind of doesn't make sense to have all the clouds, because naturally they would be in front of the ship and also in front of the planet, of course. So therefore I needed to mitigate these tones in the sky a little bit to make it more believable. And of course, as always, you can add stuff that was not in the sketch. A lot of the shape, with experience, it can evolve naturally, and you just add to the shape any way you see fit. Once you have something there, it's much easier to do it than just starting out. So what comes here next is, I would say, yeah, the exciting part, or one of the exciting parts. I really liked painting the orange of those buildings, and now we're getting to the foreground, and again I'm starting out on the bright colors because I need to dial them in so that they really punch, right? So because again later, if you were to draw the same colors over a layer of already a bluish tone, it would not be as brilliant. So yeah, in this case I recommend breaking the rules. So I'm doing patchwork now pretty much with watercolor, something that is, yeah, as I said, it's not really recommended, but if you know what you're doing and how to be precise, then you can get away with it. And what you can see here is the bleeding into the whites really acts like highlights on those coats, on those, yeah, cloth. Next thing is the armor. And the armor, you have to be super careful, because everything shiny just stays white for the majority of the time, and you gradually get darker, and you have to recite those tones that would be reflecting in the material, like the blues, the dark bluish grays, stuff like that. It needs to be high contrast, but you cannot kill the whites. If you kill the white, then you kill the entire material appeal of the metal. So that is something that I'm actually pretty good at. I'm not so good at the wet technique, working tone in tone, but working like this from bright emulating material to dark, it's something that always, yeah, it always worked for me. But that is also, I think, because I did so much digital that it kind of serves as a practice for now going back to analog, right? If that makes sense. And already you can see that stuff that is not reflective, like the overall or the gloves, I just fill them out to establish a darker baseline, to have them be more matte and more not as reflective in appearance, because there needs to be a difference in contrast between materials. Since you don't have any texture with watercolor, you need to express everything through saturation and contrast. And of course, the most difficult thing when painting people, which is why the sketch should be on point, is the proportions. Because if you get them wrong, if you seriously get them wrong, you're done. You can forget. You can never correct that, right? So you need to make sure the sketch is on point in that area, and that you have a grasp on anatomy, and whatever pieces of armor need to be well thought out before you lay them down, right? So it's good if you sketched a lot, because you need to kind of anticipate what will happen, since there is no ref for this image, right? So the ref is in your head. You need to get it right and consistent before you lay down the color, which is kind of mental gymnastics, I would say. Is something that a lot of people struggle immensely, because usually the ref gives you all the answers. And what gets me most excited is if I see that the contrast starts to pop and make sense, like it is in the clothing, and if the blacks come in and the blacks make everything all of a sudden work out and feel three-dimensional and grounded, and make the contrast bring in front what belongs in front and push the background back, that's when you can feel that everything is starting to work out. A little bit of smaller details and some blues that you should have in the reflections, and yeah, it's starting to really shape up, so that's good. Alright, so sky is here. I redid parts of it, as you could see, because I think it was too extreme in the look. Also with the planet, I was not sure that you could really get it, because this is kind of a composition, the spaceship with the planet, that's kind of a thing that it can work, but I don't know. Let me know what you think. I think it still kind of works. It's kind of interesting, but of course there's a grouping of objects that is on purpose, but it's very hard to control the outcome there. Also, I think the characters are there. Characters, I'm pretty pleased with how they look, with how the metal turned out and the contrast. And you could see that you have to be hella careful with that. Everything shiny and reflective. You must not ever put dark tones there, because if you do, you're done. You lost all your highlights. And later, what we're going to do is we're going to put a lot more dark in the foreground and make those characters stand out. And if you then are missing the highlights and the contrast, it just looks dull and uninteresting. So let's see what happens. So I'm mixing a new tone here, which I need in a second, and which is going to be basically the vegetation in between the city and the characters. which should be darker than the background, or at least the same level. But before that, we need to bring the third and final character. So they are the same, but they have different poses, of course. So yeah, the design, you should be aware how to morph your design of the clothing and of the armor in different positions so that it really looks like they're, well, remotely the same. They don't need to be the exact same, but you know, so that it sells. So yeah, once again, you could have done this differently. We could have started out with the background, but then I would have had to leave the characters empty, which is hard to do, because then when you apply the bright tones, those tones will be wet and the dark will bleed into the bright tones of the character. And now it's going to be the other way around. If I make a mistake with that background, what will happen is I will loosen a little bit of the pigments on the edge of the character and they will bleed into the background, but nothing will bleed into the character, which is, I think, yeah, much more preferable. So a little lamppost here, which I was not sure. I was thinking if I would bring this at all or not, because it's another thing that overlaps. It's another thing that will have some reflections and some lighting and will make the process more complicated. So then in good old digital art fashion, we're jumping back and forth in the background and foreground. It's a little bit like, yeah, you can't plan out all the tones. You have to also react to what is happening on canvas. It's not like digital where you put a flat tone and then you know where you are in the spectrum. The color will dry and then you will see maybe it's not enough color or not enough shadow. And now we have a substantial amount of water here on the top left in the color box. So, and that's all the dark bluish gray. Jumping a little bit here, and you can see that you have to be, this is sped up, but you have to be fast nonetheless, because if those seams dry, then you will not have a consistent tone. And this paper did not make it easy for me. And that is a little bit, maybe on this layer is the most obvious, because you can see that it dries pretty unevenly, and if you have too much water you will get stains, and if you have too little it will break up the tone. So that's, I think it's not the ideal paper to put large amounts, large volumes of consistent color. So I will keep that in mind for the future and not maybe use the paper for different stuff. So now this is a foundation and there will be dark over that again. But once again, I have to respect the characters, and this is getting now easier because down there they are darker and also simpler in shape, which is helping a lot. Because if you now would put the darker tones on the darker tones of the character's trousers, for example, it would not make such a huge impact. If you put it over the armor where it's bright, shiny, then that's a huge issue. So this is now much more forgiving, which also is why it did not take me as long anymore. I think that bottom part only took me like 50 minutes to paint, like everything you're seeing right now. And that's because, as you can see now, this is nature, and nature is the most fun to paint because it's very forgiving. You just put darks and blend tones and smudge them, and you can't really make a mistake other than mess up the composition. That is always a thing. So silhouetting these rocks in front, and that is now where the punch is coming. And that is now where the dark, the black, the deepest tones have to happen in front, the front character, and also in those rocks, so that you really sell the atmospheric distance, right? So in a second we're going here to the really dark blacks, but again, it's kind of helping to establish the lighter foundation of the rocks, and now we really bring in the blacks, which is a lot of fun. I like this process because this is, I think, is a little bit like drawing, and I really love to break the bright with something extreme. It's really a lot of fun. And when it works, you will see it immediately. It has this punchiness to it, and this illumination is starting to make sense. And all the rest now is just details. Like scene where you can put a little bit more contrast, hint at some details here and there. That is really traditional watercolor painting. That's what it excels at, that's what it's good at, if you understand it, that is. And that's also the fun part, because you're no longer trying to do something that this media is not really made for. Now that's really where it shines. Mixing in some blues, let the darks bleed in, and if you can control that, that's really where the results are getting really nice. So in a second I think we're done here. Some last touch-ups on the spaceship and some details on the skyline, some things that you were missing before or not as colorful. And then we'll move on, let you guys see the final piece. Five hours later. So yes, guys, it's been 5 hours. We came up with the result. We went from the spoil paper, which was kind of slightly bigger, to this new paper. I'll put it up for you so that you can have a clear look from the scan. It's been fun. Struggle too, but that's always the case. And just let me tell you, if you trying this, embrace the struggle. You cannot fully control the outcome here. It's impossible. And that's kind of what also makes the fun. Would I do things differently? Sure. Next time I plan on using a different paper, see where this gets me. But for now, this is fine. Some areas I really think came out great, others not so much, but hey, that's how it is. It's not digital. We cannot keep painting forever. We cannot alter everything. This is a finite process, but that's also the charm. Let me know what you think down below. As always, also, if you want the artwork, head over to ArtStation and download for your personal use. That's it. See you next time. Take care.